story of the war in Syria really begins in Iraq in 2006. As we talked about in a previous episode of this series, Iraq War II ultimately was fought on behalf of Iran's favorite of the Shiite parties, the Dawa Party and the Supreme Council for Islamic Revolution in Iraq. And their armed Bata Brigade really became the Iraqi army. Well, that's not how it was supposed to work. America was supposed to have dominance over the Shia, and they were supposed to give America dominance over Iran. But by 2006, it was clear that this was not working out the way that they had hoped. Zalmay Khalilzad and others' administration, some think tankers like Stephen Biddle at the Council on Foreign Relations, recommended what Justin Raimondo called the Sunni turn. The best article about this is a 2007 piece by Seymour Hersh in the New Yorker magazine called The Redirection. And the idea was, again, we really did empower Iran by getting rid of Saddam Hussein and putting their best friends in power in Baghdad. So now we have to figure out a way to make it up to the Arabian Sunni kings. And it's in the WikiLeaks that Zalmay Khalilzad went to apologize to the king. And the king read him the Riot Act. It used to be us, you, and Saddam Hussein against Iran. Now you have given Iraq to Iran on a golden platter. And Khalilzad promised the king that we would make it up to him. And so that was when America started backing the Sunni tribes in western Iraq to marginalize the worst of the al-Qaeda guys there, while at the same time beginning to back al-Qaeda and bin Ladenite type forces, Fatah al-Islam in Lebanon, Muslim Brotherhood groups in Syria, and Jundallah in Iran, as well as a Marxist Kurdish group, PJAK, the Iranian branch of the PKK in Turkey, and started supporting these groups to try to attack and hem in Iran. The redirection is truly the key to understanding American foreign policy in the Middle East in the post-Iraq War II era. Oops, we gave the Iranians friends Baghdad. We can't reverse that policy by starting that war and the sectarian cleansing campaign all over again from the other direction. So now we have to look for consolation prizes. And this is exactly the motivation that President Barack Obama explained to Jeffrey Goldberg of The Atlantic magazine in the spring of 2012 for America's support for the uprising against Bashar al-Assad in Syria. Goldberg asks Obama, "Don't you think that getting rid of Bashar al-Assad in Syria would be a good way to weaken Iran?" And Obama said yes, and that's exactly what we're doing. Goldberg says he's still hanging on to power. Is there anything more that can be done to see to it that Assad is removed? And Obama says, well, I could tell you, Jeffrey, but you don't have a high enough security clearance. In other words, a less funny take on the old I'd tell you but I'd have to kill you joke, implying that America had already begun covert action to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria, which was true. It was reported in late 2011 that Obama had signed 2 findings authorizing enhanced covert action against Iran and Syria. We know from reports from the summer of 2011 that the Saudis were already sending jihadists. We know from reports from the late summer of 2011 that French Special Operations Forces and spies were in their former colony of Syria, helping to organize resistance against the Assad regime there. And we know that Obama himself had authorized increased covert support by the end of the year. At the end of February 2012, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was interviewed by CBS News, and the CBS reporter asked her, from the position of the mainstream media consensus, why isn't America doing more to help to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Syria? Well, Hillary was more hawkish than President Obama on the question at that time and later, but she was in the position of defending his policy. And so she made an extremely compelling argument to CBS News. She said, listen, we know that al-Qaeda is supporting the revolution in Syria. Are we backing al-Qaeda in Syria? Be generous. She wasn't talking about direct aid. She was just saying, listen, if a revolution and a regime change in Syria is what Ayman al-Zawahiri, the leader of al-Qaeda, wants, then are we sure that we want to participate in a policy that could very well empower al-Qaeda in this place? She knew exactly what she was doing, and this was the policy that she continued to support. Obama himself later told the New York Times' Thomas Friedman that the idea that there was somewhere in Syria an army of moderates, lawyers and doctors and pharmacists and teachers, who were going to be able to face down al-Qaeda on one side and other Islamist groups like Ahrar al-Sham and Muslim Brotherhood groups, and at the same time take on the Syrian state and their allies in Hezbollah and Iran who had come to back them, was simply a fantasy. That was President Obama's words. So Hillary Clinton was warning. She's told CBS News, we don't see anyone prepared in Syria to take over the country. And yet they did it anyway. They launched an operation called Timber Sycamore, where they spent $1 billion a year backing this al-Qaeda-led insurgency in Syria. It was also backed by our allies, the Turks, the Israelis, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Kuwaitis, and they poured billions of dollars and weapons into that country to help the jihadists fight. Now, most of the time, it's true, they had a somewhat deniable operation where they would have a less jihadist, more moderate type group that would promise to hold elections one day or something, would receive the bulk of the money and the guns. But in that war, all those things, of course, were fungible. And of course, the battle was led not by moderates at all, but by the extremists of the al-Nusrah Front, which, as Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton's State Department were all too happy to verify and confirm for us, that the al-Nusrah Front is nothing but an alias, their words, an alias for al-Qaeda in Iraq, in Syria. When John McCain traveled to Syria in 2013, he met with some mythical moderates called the Northern Storm Brigade, and took some pictures and posed with them and promised American support, which was delivered. But then it came out that this same group, the Northern Storm Brigade, were responsible for kidnapping and murdering a bunch of Lebanese Shiite pilgrims. They were the same group that later sold Steven Sotloff to ISIS, who cut his head off. Well, then there's the Al-Farouk Brigade. They're pretty moderate. They said they wanted to hold elections and would respect freedom of speech and religion. Oh, here's some footage of their military commander eating a dead soldier's heart. But then there's Noor al-Zinki. Those guys are moderate. CIA gave them zillions of dollars worth of guns, tow missiles. Yeah, they're the ones filmed beheading a young man in the back of a pickup truck and laughing about it. These are essentially bin Ladenites, no different from the agenda of al-Qaeda, and nothing moderate about them. There never was. The local Sunni tribal leaders in Baathis had marginalized al-Qaeda in Iraq almost to a point of non-existence. They had named themselves the Islamic State of Iraq back in 2006 when their numbers were dwindling to the low hundreds. Al-Qaeda in Iraq was dead by the will of the local Iraqis, thank God. Then Obama comes and brought them right back to life. And they came in and created a massive battle space in Syria and fought this war. In the case of the war in Syria, there's no question that Bashar Assad has been ruthless and merciless in his prosecution of the war. But it's not a civil war. It's not a democratic uprising. More than any other thing, the fairest characterization of the war in Syria is that it is an invasion launched by jihadist mercenary forces backed by the United States of America, world superpower, and its allies, for their purposes, because they hate their strategic adversary in the region, Iran and its Shiite alliance, more than they hate al-Qaeda, the butchers of New York City who've spilled innocent American blood. And so when it comes to the American establishment's point of view, at the top of the Republican and the Democratic parties, this is the way it has to be, because they hate Iran more. Many of us warned in 2011, 2012, 2013 that al-Qaeda is growing more and more powerful and that Western Iraq is wide open for the taking. By 2013, ISIS had split off from the al-Nusrah Front But this was really just essentially the Iraqi-dominated faction of al-Qaeda in Iraq, splitting off from the Syrian-dominated faction of al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Nusrah Front, and also breaking off from the authority of Ayman al-Zawahiri, hiding out in Pakistan, bin Laden's former partner and the leader of al-Qaeda by that time after bin Laden's death in 2011. By 2013, they had broken off from al-Qaeda, and they were beginning to consolidate power in eastern Syria. This group, which had named itself the Islamic State of Iraq back in 2006, when they didn't control so much as a county seat anywhere, had the opportunity, as they were consolidating power in eastern Syria in 2013, to then take that fight into western Iraq. It later came out that the Defense Intelligence Agency under General Mike Flynn had put out a report in August of 2012 warning that that exact same thing was a likely possibility, that those creating an Islamic State in eastern Syria now could pose a major danger to western Iraq. Barack Obama's response was that ISIS was nothing but the junior varsity team, and no one needed to pay any attention to that. That was in January 2014. A few days later, they hoisted the black flag over Fallujah. 6 months later, they seized all of western Iraq and declared the caliphate. Check out my writings at antiwar.com, my show at scotthorton.org, the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, and my books, Fool's Errand, Time to End the War in Afghanistan, and Enough Already, Time to End the War on Terrorism, at enoughalreadybook.net.